We had not been able to shut up all the Austrian force in Ulm. Werneck escaped by the way of Heidenheim, and the Archduke hastened after him. They were both in full flight, but fate had pronounced her decree, and against that there is no appeal. Napoleon, being informed in the middle of the night that they were advancing on Albeck, immediately summoned the Grand Duke. "A division," said he, "has escaped from the garrison and threatens our rear. Pursue and destroy it. Let not one escape." The rain descended in torrents, and the roads were in a dreadful condition, but fatigue and danger were forgotten in the triumph of victory. Our troops hastened onward, intent on conquest. Murat came up with the enemy, attacked and routed him. He pursued him closely in his flight for the space of 2 leagues, scarcely allowing him time to take breath. Some masses occupied Erbrechtingen with cannon. Night had set in, and our horses were exhausted. We halted. The 9th Light arrived about 10 o'clock. We then advanced, the attack was resumed. Village, artillery, caissons, all were taken. General O'Donnell endeavored to keep his ground with his rearguard, but he was observed by one of our quartermasters, who wounded him and made him prisoner. It was midnight, our troops were overcome with fatigue, and we pursued our triumph no farther. The enemy fled precipitately in the direction of Nordlingen, where we possessed artillery and depots. It was important to prevent his reaching that point. Murat detached some parties, who, by harassing and impeding him in his march, forced him to take up a position, that is to say, to lose time. On the other hand, General Rivaud was to put the bridge of Donauwörth in a state of security and to proceed with the surplus of his force to the Wiesnitz. Every passage was intercepted. These arrangements being made, the prince began his march and came up with the Archduke, who was deploying on Neresheim. We attacked him with the enthusiasm inspired by victory. The shock was irresistible. The cavalry fled, and the infantry laid down their arms. Guns, standards, troops, all were taken in a mass. The most terrible disorder prevailed. Klein, Fauconnet, and Lanous continued the pursuit, intercepted the enemy on every side, and dispersed him in every direction. Werneck was summoned to surrender. He hesitated, but a combination of extraordinary circumstances at length induced him to do so. The officer appointed to escort the French flag of truce crossed several plains in quest of his chief. He met the Prince of Hohenzollern, to whom he communicated the object of his mission. The prince accompanied him, not doubting that the field marshal would accept the conditions. They directed their course to Nordlingen, which they found occupied not by the Austrians, but by French troops. On the other hand, General Lassalle had advanced on Merking and had taken 1,000 men. The fugitives spread alarm in the enemy's headquarters. These accounts staggered Werneck, and he showed himself disposed to treat. He detained the French officer and sent as a hostage the major of the regiment of Ranitz. He deferred the negotiation until next day, for he wished to try the chances of the night. As soon as it was dark, he proposed to combine his forces with those of the Archduke, but the French intercepted the road, and General Rivaud drove back Liechtenstein and penetrated the great park, which our hussars attacked in the rear. Werneck dared not go farther. He thought himself surrounded, and he negotiated. Our troops occupied the heights in order to be prepared against a surprise, but night advanced. Hohenzollern, who on the preceding day had regarded the capitulation as inevitable, now availed himself of darkness to elude it. General Mischieri followed his example. They escaped with the cavalry and a few infantry troops which had formed a part of the corps that had laid down arms. It might have been supposed that they were bound by the engagements of their chief, but no such thing. At least they thought so, for they rejoined the wrecks of the Archduke's force, with which they threw themselves on the Prussian territory. We came up with them at Gunderhausen and demanded the fulfillment of the convention. The Prince of Schwarzenberg referred to orders, wished to clear up doubts, to write, to explain, in a word, to gain time. The Prussians insisted on their neutrality. They required that the city should not be attacked, and that the enemy's column should evacuate it. A person in magisterial robes came, escorted by a party of the Archduke's officers, to threaten us with the displeasure of King William. Klein was not the man to be intimidated by this kind of masquerade. He sent to the Grand Duke the magistrate in the Austrian interest and gave the signal for the attack. The Prince of Schwarzenberg was quite disconcerted. He had not imagined that the general was so near at hand. He protested against the violation of the Prussian territory and proposed that we should respect it and not occupy Gunderhausen. Klein told him to set a good example, and he would follow it. We continued to advance, and yet Schwarzenberg came to no decision. Murat, tired of being taken for a dupe, gave orders for terminating the discussions and marching forward. The enemy's rearguard then set off at full gallop and left us in possession of the place. We pursued him for several leagues without being able to come up with him. It was night, and we took a position. We resumed our march at daybreak, but the Archduke had fled so rapidly that we did not overtake the rear of his baggage until we reached Nuremberg. A piquet of our advance guard charged him and obliged the escort battalion to lay down their arms. The piquet then pressed forward and entered a woody road, thronged with artillery and baggage, pursuing some hundreds of dragoons who vainly endeavored to rally themselves. The great body of the Austrian force was awaiting us in an advantageous position. Our chasseurs were obliged to fall back, but the hussars and carabiniers advanced, and the army was completely routed. The Archduke himself narrowly escaped being made prisoner. This was a finishing stroke to the corps, who had escaped from Ulm. In the short space of 5 days, 7,000 brave men marched over 45 leagues, destroyed an army of 25,000 men, took their military chest and baggage, carried off 128 pieces of cannon, 11 standards, and made from 12 to 15,000 prisoners. Of all the Archduke's force, nothing now remained but a few thousand unfortunate men scattered about in the woods. Klein, however, persisted in his demands, and Werneck himself urged the fulfillment of the conditions that had been entered into. They required that the officers included in the capitulations should surrender themselves prisoners. The French general addressed his remonstrances to the Archduke, or, in his absence, to the general commanding the Austrian army. But such disorder prevailed that the flag of truce was obliged to advance into the very heart of Bohemia before he could find an officer to receive his dispatches. The answer was long expected, but it at length arrived. It was a letter from General Kolorath, who transmitted to us the following correspondence. To Count Hohenzollern, Lieutenant General in the service of His Imperial and Royal Majesty, you have submitted Lieutenant General Werneck's letter to my consideration. I must inform you that, according to the rules of war and the law of nations, I regard the pretensions of the French general as very illegal. Consequently, I declare that you, and the troops with whom you have returned, cannot be included in the capitulation. I therefore order you, as well as them, to continue to serve as before. Signed, Ferdinand. Countersigned, Morval, Major and Aide-de-Camp. Aigre, October 23rd, 1805. By this document, the capitulation was rendered no capitulation, and thus Hohenzollern had fled without any violation of honor. He seemed astonished at being required to surrender in a mass troops which he was losing no less effectually in detail. His letter was curious. It was as follows. To Field Marshal Baron Werneck. Dear comrade, I cannot conceal my astonishment at the proposition that has been made to me to surrender with the cavalry which formed part of your corps. When I left you, you in my presence refused to enter into any capitulation, and, for my part, I intended to bring back the cavalry to the army at all hazards, if you could not extricate yourself with the infantry. I endeavored to do this, and I succeeded. I do not understand by what law I can be accounted a prisoner of war, not having been present at your arrangements, in which I should never have suffered myself to be included. Having been separated from you since yesterday, I no longer conceive myself bound to fulfill your orders. I receive the commands of His Royal Highness, our General-in-Chief. I have the honor to be your very humble and obedient servant, signed, Lieutenant General Hohenzollern, Privy Councillor. Napoleon was satisfied with himself, with the army, and with everybody. He expressed his approbation of our conduct by the following proclamation. Soldiers of the Great Army, in the space of 15 days we have finished the campaign. All that we proposed to do has been accomplished. We have driven from Bavaria the troops of the House of Austria and restored our ally to the sovereignty of his states. That army, which, with equal presumption and imprudence, came to station itself on our frontiers, has been annihilated. But what does it signify to England? Her object is fulfilled. We are no longer at Boulogne, and her subsidy will be neither more nor less. Of the 100,000 men who compose that army, 60,000 are prisoners. They will supply the place of our conscripts in agricultural labors. 200 pieces of cannon, the whole park, 90 standards, and all their generals are in our hands. Scarcely 15,000 men have escaped. Soldiers, I announce to you a great battle. But thanks to the ill-concerted plans of the enemy, I have obtained all the success I anticipated without encountering any risk, and it is a circumstance unparalleled in the history of nations that so great a triumph should have diminished our force only by 1,500 men rendered unfit for service. Soldiers, this success is due to the full confidence you reposed in your emperor, to your patience under fatigue and privation of every kind, and to your singular intrepidity. But we shall not stop here. You are eager to commence a second campaign. The Russian army, which English gold has transported from the further extremity of Europe, will experience a similar fate. The present campaign is particularly connected with the glory of the French infantry. The question, which has already been determined in Switzerland and Holland, will now be decided for the second time. Namely, whether the French infantry be the first or the second in Europe. There are among the Russians no generals over whom I can hope to obtain glory. All my care will be to gain the victory with the least possible effusion of blood. My soldiers are my children. We had now done with the Austrians, and we advanced to meet the Russians. Kutuzov affected resolution, and we thought him disposed to fight. We congratulated ourselves on this new opportunity of augmenting our glory. But all this was mere pretense on the part of Kutuzov. He abandoned the inn, the Tron, and the Ems, and disappeared. We pressed forward on Vienna. We advanced with inconceivable speed. Never was a movement executed with such rapidity. The emperor became apprehensive. He feared lest, by this precipitancy, our rear might be endangered and our flank exposed to the Russians. Murat, said he to me, runs on like a blind man. He presses forward as though the only object were to enter Vienna. The enemy has nobody to oppose him. He may dispose of all his forces and destroy Mortier. Direct Berthier to stop the columns. Berthier came. Marshal Soult received orders to fall back as far as Mautern. Davout took up his position at the junction of the roads of Lilienfeld and Neustadt, and Bernadotte stationed himself at Melk. But these arrangements did not prevent the engagement of which Napoleon feared the issue. 4,000 French were attacked by the whole of the enemy's force, but skill, courage, and the necessity of conquering made amends for our inferiority of numbers. The Russians were driven back. The intelligence of this astonishing victory set our whole force in motion. The emperor pursued his march with even more eagerness than he had before, evinced in suspending it. He wished to come up with the Austrians, to take the passage of the Danube, to turn and cut off their allies, and beat them before they could receive reinforcements. He hastily dispatched orders. Men and horses, all were immediately in motion. "The field is open," said Napoleon. "Murat may yield to his natural impetuosity, but he must take a wider range. He must surprise the bridge." He immediately wrote to him as follows: The grand object at the present moment is to pass the Danube, in order to drive the Russians from Krems by attacking their rear. The enemy will probably destroy the bridge of Vienna, and yet, if there should be any possibility of gaining it undamaged, that must be done. This consideration alone can induce the Emperor to enter Vienna, and in that case, you must introduce into the city only a portion of your cavalry and the grenadiers. It is necessary that you should ascertain the force of the civic guard in Vienna. The Emperor presumes that you have planted some pieces of cannon to intercept the passage across the Danube between Krems and Vienna. Some parties of cavalry should be stationed on the right bank of the river, but you mention nothing of this to the Emperor. His Majesty thinks it necessary to know what he has to trust to, so that if it should be possible to intercept the Danube below Vienna, it may be done. General Suchet's division will remain with a portion of your cavalry on the great road leading from Vienna to Buckersdorf, at least if you be not master of the bridge across the Danube, and if it has not been burned. In that case, Suchet's division must repair thither in order to be enabled to cross the river with your cavalry and grenadiers, and to march on as rapidly as possible to fall on the communications of the Russians. I think it probable that the Emperor will remain all the day at St. Polten. His Majesty recommends you, Prince, to transmit to him frequent accounts of your proceedings. When you arrive at Vienna, provide yourself with the best maps that can be procured of the environs of that city and of Lower Austria. Should General Count Julet, or any other individual, wish to have an interview with the Emperor, send him hither with all speed. The civic guard on duty at Vienna must amount to upwards of 500 men. When once you reach Vienna, you may easily obtain intelligence of the arrival of the other Russian columns, as well as of the design of those who have established themselves at Krems. You will have your own cavalry, together with the corps of Marshals Lannes and Davout, in the operation of turning the Russians and falling on their rear. As to the corps of Marshals Bernadotte and Soult, they cannot be disposed of until we shall definitively know what course the Russians may adopt. After 10 o'clock in the morning, you may enter Vienna, endeavor to surprise the bridge of the Danube, or, if it should be destroyed, adopt the most speedy means of crossing the river. That is the grand affair at present. But if, before 10 o'clock, Monsieur de Julet should present himself with proposals for negotiating and inducing you to suspend your march, you may stop your movement on Vienna, but you must nevertheless direct your attention to the best means of crossing the Danube at Klosterneuburg, or some other favorable point. The Emperor directs that between Segardskirchen and Vienna, you shall station, at the distance of 2 French leagues from each other, posts of cavalry consisting of 10 men each, whose horses will serve as relays to the officers, whom you may send with accounts of your movements. The men forming these posts may bear dispatches from Segardskirchen to St. Polten. Marshal Bessières will station posts of the Emperor's Guard. We were at St. Polten. Napoleon was riding on horseback on the Vienna road when he perceived an open carriage advancing, in which was seated a priest and a lady bathed in tears. The Emperor was dressed as usual in the uniform of a colonel of the Chasseurs of the Guard. The lady did not know him. He inquired the cause of her affliction and whither she was going. "Sir," she replied, "I have been robbed at about 2 leagues from here by a party of soldiers who have killed my gardener. I am going to request that your Emperor will grant me a guard. He once knew my family well, and lay under obligations to them." "Your name?" inquired Napoleon. "De Bruni," answered the lady. "I am the daughter of Monsieur de Marbeuf, formerly governor of Corsica." "I am delighted to meet with you, madam," exclaimed Napoleon with the most charming frankness, "and to have an opportunity of serving you. I am the Emperor." The lady was amazed. Napoleon consoled her and directed her to wait for him at headquarters. He treated her with the utmost attention, granted her a piquet of chasseurs of his guard, and sent her away happy and contented. Napoleon had received a report, which he was reading with an air of satisfaction. I entered his office. "Well, Rapp," said he, "do you know that we have parties of our troops in the very heart of Bohemia?" "Yes, sire." "Do you know what sort of cavalry has beaten the Uhlans, captured posts, and taken magazines?" "No, sire." "Our infantry mounted on draft horses." "How?" He handed me the report. Some of our detachments who had penetrated into Bohemia suddenly found themselves in an open tract of country. They had only 20 dragoons, they would not fall back, and they dared not advance further. In this perplexing situation, the commander thought of an expedient. He collected together all the baggage horses, mounted his infantry, and thus equipped, led them through the thick forests in the neighborhood of Egra. Some parties of the enemy's cavalry who advanced to oppose them were driven back. We took men, horses, and provisions. The latter were committed to the flames. I returned the report to the emperor. "Well," said he, "what do you think of this new kind of cavalry?" "Admirable, sire." "Men who have French blood in their veins," observed he, "always know how to deal death among the enemy's ranks." We marched close upon the enemy's rearguard. We might easily have taken it, but we avoided doing so. We wished to lull his vigilance. We did not press him closely, and we circulated reports of peace. We suffered both troops and baggage to escape us, but the loss of a few men was of little consequence. The preservation of the bridges was the important point. If they should be broken, it was determined that we should repair them. We took our measures accordingly. The troops who were posted in echelon on the road were warned to allow no demonstration to escape them that was likely to put the enemy on his guard. No one was permitted to enter Vienna, but everything being examined and every arrangement completed, the Grand Duke took possession of the capital and directed Lanusis and Bertrand to make without delay a reconnaissance on the river. They found at the gates of the suburb a post of Austrian cavalry. There had been no fighting for upwards of 3 days. It appeared as though an armistice had been entered into. Lanusis and Bertrand accosted the Austrian commandant, commenced a conversation with him, followed him closely, and would not suffer him to quit them. On reaching the banks of the river, they still persisted in following him, in spite of his wish to get rid of them. The Austrian became impatient. The French generals asked leave to communicate with the general commanding the troops stationed on the left bank of the river. They obtained permission to do so, but the 10th Hussars were not allowed to accompany them, and they were consequently obliged to halt and take a position. Meanwhile, our troops were advancing, led by the Grand Duke and Marshal Lannes. The bridge still remained undamaged, but the trains were laid, and the gunners held their matches in readiness. The least sign that might have indicated the intention of passing by force would have ruined the enterprise. It was necessary to resort to artifice, and we succeeded in imposing on the simplicity of the Austrians. The 2 marshals dismounted, and only a small detachment entered upon the bridge. General Belliard advanced, walking with his hands behind his back, accompanied by 2 officers of the staff. Lannes joined him with some others. They walked about, talking together, and at length joined the Austrians. The officer commanding the post at first directed them to stand back, but he at length permitted them to advance, and they entered into conversation together. They repeated what had already been affirmed by General Bertrand, namely, that the negotiations were advancing, that the war was at an end, and that there would be no more fighting and slaughter. "Why," said the marshal, "do you keep your guns still pointed at us? Has there not been enough of bloodshed? Do you wish to attack us and to prolong miseries which weigh more heavily on you than on us? Come, let us have no more provocation. Turn your guns." Half persuaded and half convinced, the commanding officer yielded. The artillery was turned in the direction of the Austrians, and the troops laid down their arms in bundles. During this conference, the platoon of our advance guard came up slowly, and at length it arrived, masking sappers and gunners, who threw the combustible matters into the river, sprinkled water on the powder, and cut the trains. The Austrian commander, who was not sufficiently acquainted with the French language to take much interest in the conversation, perceived that the troop was gaining ground and endeavored to make us understand that he could not permit it. Marshal Lannes and General Belliard tried to satisfy him. They observed that the cold was severe and that our men were only marching about to warm themselves. But the column still continued to advance, and it was already 3/4 over the bridge. The commander lost all patience and ordered his troops to fire. They instantly took up their arms, and the artillerymen prepared their guns. Our situation was terrible. A little less presence of mind on our part, and the bridge would have been blown up, our troops in the river, and the campaign at an end. But the Austrian had to deal with men who were not easily disconcerted. Marshal Lannes seized him by one arm, and General Belliard by the other. They threatened him and drowned his voice when he attempted to call for help. Meanwhile, the Prince of Hohenzollern arrived, accompanied by General Bertrand. An officer set off to render an account of the state of affairs to the Grand Duke, and, on his way, transmitted to the troop an order to quicken their march and arrive speedily. The marshal advanced to meet the prince, complained of the conduct of the commander of the post, requested that he might be punished and removed from the rearguard, where he might impede the negotiations. Hohenzollern fell into the snare. He deliberated, approved, contradicted, and lost himself in a useless conversation. Our troops made the most of their time. They arrived, debouched, and the bridge was taken. Reconnaissances were immediately ordered in every direction, and General Belliard led our columns on the road leading to Stockerau, where they took a position. Hohenzollern, mortified at his ill-timed loquacity, proceeded to the Grand Duke, who, after a short conversation, referred him to Napoleon and also crossed the river. The Austrian piquet still kept guard on the bridge. We bivouacked in confusion. The troops were mingled together at Stockerau as on the banks of the river. Napoleon found that this interspersion was not convenient, and he sent the Uhlans to Vienna, where they were disarmed. We arrived at Austerlitz. The Russians had a force superior to ours. They had repulsed our advance guard, and they thought us already subdued. The attack commenced, but instead of that easy conquest, which had been obtained merely by their guard, they everywhere experienced the most obstinate resistance. The battle had already lasted an hour, and it was still far from being decided in their favor. They resolved to make a last attempt on our center. The Imperial Guard deployed. Infantry, cavalry, and artillery advanced on the bridge, without the movement being perceived by Napoleon, for the nature of the ground screened it from his observation. A discharge of musketry was soon heard. A brigade, commanded by General Jena, had been penetrated by the Russians. Napoleon ordered me to take the Mamelukes, 2 squadrons of chasseurs, and 1 of grenadiers of the guard, and to go forward to reconnoiter the state of things. I set off at full gallop, and it was not until I came within gunshot of the scene of action that I discovered the disaster. The enemy's cavalry was in the midst of our square and was sabring our troops. A little further back, we discerned masses of infantry and cavalry forming the reserve. The enemy relinquished the attack and turned to meet me. 4 pieces of artillery arrived and were placed in battery. I advanced in good order. I had the brave Colonel Morland on my left and General Dallemagne on my right. "Do you see?" said I to my troop. "Our friends and brothers trampled on by the enemy. Avenge them. Avenge our colors." We rushed on the artillery, which was taken. The cavalry, who awaited us, was repulsed by the same shock. They fled in disorder, and we, as well as the enemy, trampled over the bodies of our troops, whose squares had been penetrated. The men who had escaped being wounded were rallied. A squadron of horse grenadiers arrived to reinforce me, and I was enabled to receive the reserves who came up in aid of the Russian Guard. We resumed the attack, which was maintained with terrible fury. The infantry dared not venture to fire. All was confusion. We fought man to man. Finally, the intrepidity of our troops triumphed over every obstacle. The Russians fled and dispersed. Alexander and the Emperor of Austria witnessed the defeat. Stationed on a height, at a little distance from the field of battle, they saw the guard, which was expected to decide the victory, cut to pieces by a handful of brave men. Their guns and baggage had fallen into our hands, and Prince Repnin was our prisoner. Unfortunately, we had a great number of men killed and wounded. Colonel Morland was no more, and I had myself received a sabre wound in the head. I went to render an account of this affair to the Emperor. My broken sabre, my wound, the blood with which I was covered, the decided advantage we had gained with so small a force over the enemy's chosen troops, inspired Napoleon with the idea of the picture which was painted by Gérard. The Russians, as I have already mentioned, hoped to defeat us with their guard alone. This presumption offended Napoleon, and it was long before he forgot it. After the Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon made me a general of division and sent me to the castle of Austerlitz until I should recover from my wound, which, however, was not dangerous. The Emperor visited me several times, once on the day on which he granted an interview to the Emperor of Austria. He put into my hands 2 letters which had been intercepted by our advanced posts. One was from Prince Charles, and the other from a Prince Liechtenstein. Their contents were rather important, and I got them translated. On his way back in the evening, Napoleon came and had these letters read to him. He talked to me a great deal about Francis II, his complaints and regrets, and told me many curious circumstances respecting him. We set out for Schönbrunn, and in about a fortnight after our arrival there, Napoleon sent for me. "Are you able to travel?" said he. "Yes, sire." "Well then, go and give an account of the Battle of Austerlitz to Marmont, in order to vex him for not having come, and observe the effect that it will produce on the Italians." He then gave me the following instructions. "Monsieur General Rapp, you will proceed to Graz, where you will remain as long as may be necessary to communicate to General Marmont the details of the Battle of Austerlitz. Inform him that the negotiations are open, but that nothing is concluded, and that he must therefore hold himself in readiness for any event that may occur. You must also make yourself acquainted with General Marmont's situation, and ascertain what number of the enemy's forces is before him. Tell him that I desire he will send spies into Hungary, and that he will communicate to me all the information he may collect. You must next repair to Ljubljana, where you will find Marshal Masséna, who has the command of the 8th Army Corps, and transmit to me a correct report of his situation. You will inform Masséna that if the negotiations are broken off, as it is possible they may be, he will be sent to Vienna. Let me know what amount of the enemy's force Marshal Masséna has before him, and report to me the situation of his corps in every point of view. You will next proceed to Palmanova, after strongly urging Marshal Masséna to arm and provision the fortress in an effectual way, and you will inform me of the state in which it is. Next, proceed and examine the posts which we occupy before Venice, and ascertain the state of our troops. Thence, you will repair to the army of General Saint-Cyr, who is about to march on Naples. You must ascertain the nature and the amount of his force. You will return by way of Klagenfurt, where you will see Marshal Ney, and then rejoin me. Do not fail to write to me from every place at which you stop. Dispatch couriers to me from Graz, Ljubljana, Palmanova, Venice, and the place where the army of Naples may be stationed. I pray God to take you into his holy keeping. Napoleon, Schönbrunn, 25 Frimaire, year 14. I rejoined Napoleon at Munich, whither he had gone to be present at the marriage of Prince Eugène. The prince came from Italy, and I accompanied him. During my absence, peace had been concluded at Vienna. The emperor had an interview with Prince Charles. He intended to have presented him with a magnificent sword, but he was displeased with the archduke, and the sword was not given. We set out for Paris. Acclamations resounded on every side. Napoleon was never received with so much enthusiasm. That concludes the third part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.